What a lot of us call our personality is not your essence, but the version of you that formed around safety. Most people look at their chart like it's something happening to them, but it's actually a reflection of what's happening within you. And once you understand that, astrology starts to make a lot more sense. Welcome to Starwell Astrology. My name is Shari, and I'm a Western tropical astrologer with a very special interest in shadow work. On this channel, I explore astrology through a deeper lens, looking at patterns that shape how we think, feel, and experience life. Also, I explore esotericism, mysticism, and astrotheology. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the hype button. I appreciate it for those who have been. I really do. Thank you. And also share with anyone who might find this of interest or useful. If you want to go deeper into this work, I host a free shadow work circle every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And you can join through my website at starwellastro.com. I also need to mention that I do offer natal chart readings and one-on-one shadow work guidance for those who want a more personal approach. And everything is available on my website at starwellastro.com. Now, before we go into the moon in the houses, I want to give you a deeper way to understand what you're actually looking at when you look at the natal chart. Because your natal chart isn't something that is random, it's a system that's reflecting your internal pattern. And it also reflects how you experience life from the inside out. Not just what happens to you, but how you perceive it, how you feel it, how you make sense of it, how you relate to it, respond to it, and all of that becomes the visible world. So when I talk about astrology, I'm talking about your inner cosmology, a symbolic map of how your inner world is organized. And when we look at identity, most people assume identity starts with the mind, with thoughts, opinions, and the story we tell ourselves about who we are. But if we go deeper than that, the sun represents the core self, the core life force of the self. It's the authentic center. It's our essential being. So the pure light, just like the sun, is who we are before adaptation. But that light does not enter life untouched. It gets filtered. And one of the first and deepest filters is the moon. The moon shows the emotional body, and the emotional body represents our memory, conscious or unconscious. The moon represents our conditioning, our attachments, our protection. It shows what feels safe and what feels threatening, what the system learned it needed in order to belong. So the moon does not erase the sun, but it can filter it, and it can shape how that essential self get expressed through emotional patternings, familiarity, and protection. And that is why the deeper architect of the personality is often not Mercury first, it's the moon. Because the moon is the part of you that is constantly asking, am I safe? Am I accepted? Am I protected? Do I belong here? Can I relax? And those questions start shaping the self long before the mind starts forming conclusions. So even though Mercury describes thought, language, interpretation, and it makes up the story that represents who we think we are. Mercury is often making sense through the filters of the moon. So the mind explains, but the moon decides what feels safe enough to believe. And then Venus starts organizing attraction around it. So Venus reflects our values as well as our desires, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we believe we're worthy of receiving. And very often, Venus is drawn towards what feels emotionally familiar. But even that familiarity is rooted in conditioning rather than truth. Then Mars acts from it. Mars shows how we respond when something gets activated because Mars is the active agent in the chart. So Mars shows us how we are willing to defend ourselves, how we pursue what we want, how we move when we feel desire and frustration and threat or urgency or passion. But Mars shows how we take action based on our desires, our frustration, our passions, our what feels threatening or urgent. And then the ascendant shows how the whole system meets life on the surface. It's the lens of embodiment. It's the way the inner world enters the outer world and how the self comes across, how your whole chart gets carried into lived experience and perceived by others. So if the sun is the core light, the moon filters what feels safe, Mercury makes meaning out of it, and Venus is drawn to what reflects it. Mars acts when it gets activated, and the ascendant is how the whole pattern becomes visible. And together, they can create what looks like a personality. But a lot of that personality may actually be structured around emotional conditioning. And this is what is so important because it's the part of what I am calling the false self. Now, your emotions are not false by any means, and your wounds are not false either. And your experiences are very real and true to you. But over time, the personality can begin organizing itself around adaptation, protection, familiarity, and survival. And instead of the deeper truth of who we are, which is the core essence of the sun, gets filtered through the emotional body. So when we look at the moon in the house, we're not just looking at emotions in a general sense. We're looking at where the conditioned self goes looking for safety, where emotional patterns get lived out most strongly, and how this part of us seeks reassurance, familiarity, comfort, and protection. Now, when we look at any placement in the chart, we're always looking at three things: the planet, which is what function is happening, the sign, which is how that function operates within you, and the house is where it shows up in your lived experience. So, in other words, the sign represents the style of the pattern, and the house reflects the area of life where the pattern tends to play out. So, every placement in the chart can be expressed consciously or unconsciously. What we call the shadow is not something separate. It's the same energy, just operating without awareness. And this is why shadow work is so important because shadow work is not about fixing yourself. It's about becoming aware of what is already operating within you. It helps you notice the emotional patterns, the protective reaction, and the conditioned responses that has quietly shaped the self you think you are. So shadow work helps you move from unconsciously living inside the pattern and actually witnessing it. And this is how we truly begin to know ourselves. The self I'm speaking of is your core essence. So the knowing of the self is not just a false self we're conditioned to believe we are, but a deeper truth of who we are beneath that conditioning, which is called the true self, the authentic core essence, which is the unfiltered light of the sun. So, with that understanding, today we're looking at the moon in the houses and where the false self goes looking for safety. So, the moon in the first house. If you're looking at the natal chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning. It shows us memory. It shows us what becomes familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early on. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the time, the moon shows the conditioned self, the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. And when the moon is in the first house, the false self often goes looking for safety through identity, through being emotionally recognized, through moving through life in a way that allows the person to stay connected to what they feel in the moment. Because the first house is the house of self, the house of identity, presence, embodiment, and how a person meets life daily. So when the moon is here, the emotional body is very close to the surface of the self. It can create someone whose emotions are immediate, visible, present, close to their identity. This is someone who feels life very personally, and because of that, this emotional state can shape how they move through the world in a very direct way. They do not just have feelings in the background. Their feelings often become part of how they experience themselves. So, in the inner cosmology, Moon in the first house can look like a person whose sense of self is strongly shaped by emotional patterning. Who they think they are can become deeply entangled with how they feel. So if they feel rejected, they may become the rejected self. If they feel uncertain, they may become the uncertain self. If they feel emotionally secure, they may feel more fully themselves. So that is the pattern from this placement. The false self here often forms around emotional immediacy. So the person may unconsciously learn, I am what I feel. My emotions tell me who I am. If I am emotionally felt or mirrored, then I'm safe. Or if my inner state is unsettled, then my whole self feels unsettled. So the false self seeks safety through staying closely identified with its own emotional experience. And this can make the person highly intuitive, responsive, sensitive, and emotionally legible. Other people may feel them very easily, but it can also make the self overly fluid, overly reactive, too shaped by passing emotional states. Because the first house is your identity, so whatever touches the moon here can become very personal very fast. So the shadow here is not sensitivity. The shadow is over identifying with feelings, living from emotional immediacy, unconsciously becoming the mood, letting temporary emotional states define the self too completely. This can look like reacting to how you feel in the moment, assuming your emotional response is always the full truth, or shaping your identity around being emotionally seen or emotionally validated, or moving through life with a self-image that changes too much based on your inner weather. So this can also create hypersensitivity to how you are received. Because if safety is tied to identity, then becoming misread, unseen, dismissed, or emotionally unmet can feel like a threat to the self itself. So the person may become highly self-protective around their emotional presence, or they may unconsciously shapeshift in order to feel emotionally connected in the moment. And this is where it gets interesting, because if the moon is shaping the emotional patterns of the self, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. So Mercury is how we make meaning. It is how we think about what we feel, and it is how the mind interprets experience. So Mercury, depending on where it's placed in the chart, will determine how we make meaning, how we think about what we feel, and how we interpret the experience. So for someone with Moon in the first house, Mercury may end up making meaning from emotional immediacy. Their thoughts may be shaped very strongly by what they feel in the moment. So instead of stepping back and interpreting from a distance, the mind may organize itself around present emotional experiences. That can create insight and emotional intelligence, but it can also create subjective thinking. So this is where the person's interpretation can become too fused with mood, reaction, and personal feeling. Then we look at Venus, depending on where it is in your chart, what sign and house and the aspects it's making. Venus shows what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper orientation to worth and desire. So when the moon is in the first house, Venus may be drawn towards people, experiences, or dynamics that feel emotionally familiar to the self. And the person may attract what mirrors their emotional identity, what reflects their sensitivity, what feels nurturing and affirming and emotionally recognizable. But the shadow here is that they may be attracted to what feels familiar, even when the familiarity is rooted in conditioning rather than truth. So they may call something love when it is really a recognition of an old emotional pattern. And then when it comes to Mars, based on the sign and house it's in and aspects it's making, Mars is how we act. Mars is how we move, how we respond when something gets activated. So with the moon in the first house, Mars may act very quickly from the emotional body. The person may respond from feeling before reflecting. They may act based on instinct, mood, sensitivity, or emotional reactions. But that doesn't have to make them weak necessarily. It just means that their action function is more closely tied to their emotional self. So if they feel safe, they move one way, and if they feel threatened, they may move another way. And if they feel unseen, hurt, or activated, their actions may reflect that before they have fully processed what is happening. So the moon in the first house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology expresses itself through the conditioned self. But feelings are not your identity. Feelings come and go. Emotional immediacy can be honored without being the sole lens through which life is interpreted. So the work here is to learn to witness the feeling without becoming entirely fused with it, and to let the emotional body speak without handing it total authority over your identity. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something very beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply embodied, emotionally intelligent. They can be present and authentic and responsive in a way that's real. And so they're no longer being shaped unconsciously by passing emotional inner waves. Can begin to realize that I have feelings, but I am more than my feelings. I can honor my emotional reality without building my whole self around it. And I can be emotionally present without becoming emotionally defined. If the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the first house shows a conditioned self that is looking for safety through identity, presence, and emotional recognition. It shows a person whose emotional body lives close to the surface of the self and whose deeper work is to learn how to feel deeply without mistaking every feeling for who they are. Moon in the second house. If you're looking at your chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning. It shows us memory. It shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early in life. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the time, the moon shows the conditioned self. I call this the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the second house, the false self often goes looking for safety through stability, through what is familiar, through what can be held onto, through consistency. It wants what's predictable and comfortable, and it wants resources and value, and sometimes through control over what feels tangible, because the second house is the house of security. It's the house of resources and self-worth and value. It's the body and what helps us feel grounded in life. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to what feels stable. It can create someone who feels safest when life feels manageable, steady, predictable, and materially or emotionally secure. And this is often someone whose emotional system does not like too much disruption. It likes things that are stable and predictable. Because the second house wants to know, what can I rely on this? Can I trust this? Am I secure here? So the inner cosmology of the moon in the second house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by the search for stability. Who they think they are can become strongly tied to what they have, what they can keep, what they can depend on, what has consistency. what feels practical, what makes them feel emotionally and physically anchored. So the false self here often is formed around preservation. A person who unconsciously learns that if I have enough, then I'm safe. If life stays predictable, then I'm okay. If I can hold on to what matters, I can relax. If I lose stability, I lose safety. So the false self here seeks safety through grounding, but often in a way that can become overly attached to external forms of safety. This can make the person loyal, steady, calming force in your life, very nurturing, and they can be deeply connected to what brings comfort and stability. There can be something very soothing about this placement, very present, very embodied, very rooted, but it can also make the self overly dependent on what is familiar. Because when the moon is in the second house, security can start to feel like identity. So if life feels stable, the self feels more intact. And if something threatens that stability, money, routine, possessions, comfort, your self-worth, or even emotional consistency, the whole system may start feeling unsafe. So shadow work here is not groundedness. It's the shadow is attachment. Attachment to comfort, attachment to routine, attachment to what is known, attachment to what you can possess, you can own, you can preserve, or you can control. So this looks like staying in a situation too long because they feel familiar, or confusing comfort with true safety, or measuring your worth through what you have or what you can maintain, or becoming emotionally unsettled when life becomes uncertain, or feeling deeply triggered when something threatens your sense of stability. Displacement can also create scarcity in the emotional body. Not necessarily because there's never enough, but because the system may have learned to equate safety with having enough money, having enough time, having enough support, having enough love, having enough proof, having enough consistency, enough of everything. So the fear underneath can become, what if I lose what keeps me safe? What if I don't have enough? What if I can't hold onto what grounds me? What if my worth is not secure? And because the second house is also self-worth, this placement can sometimes tie emotional security to value in a very deep way. So the person may not only seek safety through what they have, they may also seek safety through feeling valuable. And this is where it gets deeper. Because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too, meaning the natal chart. So with Mercury, depending on its house sign, aspects it's making, can show us how we are making meaning, how we think about what we feel, how the mind interprets experiences. So for someone with the moon in the second house, Mercury may end up making meaning through stability, worth, and practicality. And their mind may constantly evaluate, is this secure? Is this useful? Do I trust this? Does this support me? What does this mean for my future stability? So that can create practical intelligence and grounded thinking, but also can create a mindset that becomes overly shaped by fear of loss, lack, or instability. Now, when we look at Venus, depending on the sign and house and the aspects it's making, Venus shows us what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, and what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So, with the moon in the second house, Venus may be drawn towards what feels dependable and comforting and sensual and emotionally stabilizing. So the person may attract what feels safe to their nervous system, what feels grounding, what feels familiar, what reinforces a sense of value and steadiness. And so the shadow here is that they may be drawn to familiarity, even when the familiarity is limiting. They may call something love when what they're actually feeling is relief that something feels secure. So then when it comes to Mars, depending on the sign and the house and the aspects it's making, Mars is how we act. Mars is how we move. Mars, how we respond when something gets activated. So when the moon is in the second house, Mars may act very strongly when safety, worth, money, stability, or possessions feel threatened, and the person may become defensive, protective, or reactive when something touches what they're relying on. So they may fight to preserve what feels secure. They may resist change because the emotional body experiences change as threat. So the moon in the second house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through stability. So the growth here is not about not valuing stability or being careless about what grounds you. The growth is learning that true safety cannot come only from what you hold on to. That worth is deeper than what you own, deeper than what you can earn, deeper than what you can maintain, and without needing life to always stay the same, and to let comfort support you without letting comfort define you, and to let stability nourish the self without building a whole identity around preserving it. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply rooted, emotionally steady, nurturing, present, grounded, capable of creating real safety. But they're no longer unconsciously trapped inside the belief that safety only exists in what is familiar, tangible, or controlled. They begin to realize I can value stability without clinging to it. I can honor my need for grounding without making fear my foundation. And my worth is real even when life is changing. So if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the second house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through stability, value, comfort, and groundedness. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to what feels dependable and sustaining, and whose deeper work is learning that true safety is not only something you have, it is also something you become. Moon in the third house. If you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning and memory. It shows us what becomes familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the times, the moon shows the conditioned self, the false self, the part of us that learn how to adapt emotionally to feel safe. So when the moon is in the third house, the false self often goes looking for safety through the mind, through thinking, through naming, through understanding, explaining, talking, interpreting, making sense of what is happening. Because the third house is the house of perception. It is the house of the mind, communication, language, learning, siblings, early environment, and the way we process our immediate surroundings. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to how a person thinks and interprets experiences. So this can create someone who feels safest when they're able to understand what is happening, when they can name it and talk about it, when they can mentally organize what they're feeling. And this often is someone whose emotional world moves quickly into thought because the third house wants to know, what does this mean? How do I explain this? What is happening here? How do I make sense of this? How do I communicate what I'm experiencing? So, in the inner cosmology, the moon in the third house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by mental processing. Who they think they are may become strongly tied to how they think, how they speak, how they interpret life, and how well they keep a mental grip on what they're feeling. So the false self is often formed around understanding. The person may unconsciously learn that I can explain it when I'm safe, or I can think clearly about it when I can handle it, or I can talk it through. Then I won't be overwhelmed. So they need to stay mentally engaged in order to feel connected. So the false self seeks safety through mental movement. This can make the person intelligent and observant, curious and articulate, and emotionally perceptive. They're also quick to pick up on what's happening in their environment. There can be a real gift here for language, for reflection, for emotional intelligence, for communication and from naming what others cannot quite name. But it can also create a self that becomes overly identified with mental processes. Because when the moon is in the third house, thinking can start to feel like safety itself. So if the person can make sense of what they're feeling, they feel more in control. In other words, if they can name it or explain it, then it feels better. But if things feel too emotionally undefined or chaotic, then the system starts to feel deeply unsettled. So the shadow here is not intelligence. The shadow is overprocessing, overthinking feelings, talking around feelings instead of actually feeling them, or needing to explain everything in order to regulate, or using language as a defense against emotional depth, or becoming too mentally entangled with experiences that the person loses contact with the body underneath it. So this can look like analyzing your emotions instead of inhabiting them, or thinking your way through vulnerability, or getting stuck in a mental loop when emotionally activated. You can even overshare or over-explain in order to feel safe. This placement can also make the emotional body highly responsive to the immediate environment. So the tone matters, words matter, how something is said matters, what was implied may matter. And because of that, the person may become very emotionally shaped by their earlier environment, their family dialogue, sibling dynamics, or the quality of communication they grew up around. So the nervous system may have learned very early that safety depends on paying attention, reading signals, staying mentally alert, or knowing how to interpret the room. So the fear underneath can become, what if I don't understand what's happening? What if I miss something important? What if I can't explain myself? What if no one hears me correctly? And what if I can't make sense of how I feel? And this is where it gets deeper because the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety. And then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too, represented in the natal chart. So with Mercury, depending on the sign and the house, as well as the aspects it's making, Mercury will show how you're making meaning, how you are thinking about what you're feeling, how the mind interprets experiences. So for someone with the moon in the third house, Mercury may become especially important. The mind may constantly work to process the emotional field, to explain what is happening, to organize it, to translate feeling into language. That can create a person who is thoughtful, perceptive, verbally insightful, but it can also create a person whose thoughts become too fused with their emotional state. So instead of the mind witnessing the feeling, the mind may start orbiting it. When we look at Venus, Venus is also going to be flavored by the sign and the house and the aspects it's making. But Venus can show us what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationships to worth and desire. So when the moon is in the third house, Venus may be drawn towards people, connection, and experiences that feel mentally engaging, verbally affirming, or emotionally understandable. And the people may be attracted to conversation, connection, and shared language, emotional intelligence, and the feeling of being heard or mentally met. But the shadow here is that they may confuse communication with intimacy. They may feel drawn to what is easy to talk through, even if something deeper is missing underneath. And then when we come to Mars, Mars is going to be flavored by the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making. But Mars is how we act, it's how we move, it's how we respond to something that gets activated. So with the moon in the third house, Mars can act through words first. The person may react verbally, mentally, or through quick interpretations. They may speak from the emotional body before they fully process what they're feeling. So they may get activated, and this may look like talking fast, reacting quickly, defending through explanation, using words sharply, or trying to regain safety through communication and interpretation or mental control. The moon in the third house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through thoughts, language, and perception. The growth here is not to stop thinking, and it's not to become less verbal, curious, or mentally alive. The growth is learning that understanding something is not the same as fully feeling it. That naming an emotion also is not also the same as being present with it. And that the mind is a powerful translator, but it is not the whole self. The work here is learning how to let the mind support the emotional body and to let communication become a bridge instead of a shield. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes emotionally intelligent, insightful, articulate, sensitive to nuances, capable of naming what is happening with real depth and precision, but they're no longer unconsciously trapped inside the need to mentally manage everything they feel. So they begin to realize I can understand what I feel without reducing myself to thought. I can communicate clearly without explaining myself out of my experience. So if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the third house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through thought, language, understanding, and mental communications. So it shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to perception, interpretation, and communication, and whose deeper work is learning that true safety does not come only from making sense of everything. It also comes from being able to stay present with what cannot always be explained right away. Moon in the fourth house. If you're looking at a natal chart as an inner cosmology, the symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body, it shows our conditioning, it shows our memory, it shows how we become familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early on. And because of this, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of times, the moon shows the conditioned self, the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the fourth house, the false self often goes looking for safety through home, roots, family, emotional belonging, and inner foundation. Because the fourth house is the house of home. It is the house of roots, family, ancestry, emotional memory, the private self, the deeper foundation of the psyche. And this is also important, not just because the fourth house is an angular house, but also because the moon rules the fourth house. So this tends to have a stronger effect on the personal structure of this person's life. So when the moon is here, its symbolism becomes much stronger. It is one of the most lunar placements in the chart. So the emotional body is not off to the side here, it's at the root. And when the moon is in the fourth house, the person's emotional life often runs very deep. This can create someone whose inner world is rich, sensitive, private, and strongly shaped by family experiences and emotional imprinting and the atmosphere they came from. And feels this is someone who feels things in their roots. they who carry memory deeply and who may have a profound emotional bond to family, whether that bond feels nourishing, complicated, painful, protective, or all of those all at once. Because the fourth house wants to know, where is home? Where do I belong? Where do I feel safe? What is familiar to my emotional foundation that lives underneath the surface self? So, in the inner cosmology, Moon in the fourth house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes strongly shaped by the need for inner safety, for emotional belonging, and for connecting to what feels rooted. So, the false self here often forms around emotional belonging. So, the person may unconsciously learn, I'm safe when I feel at home. I'm safe when I feel emotionally held and when I stay close to what feels familiar. It's also my inner foundation. If my inner foundation is unsettled, then I am unsettled. So the false self checks safety through emotional roots, through family, through the private world, through memory, through whatever gives the psyche a sense of continuity and emotional shelter. This can make the person deeply caring, protective, receptive, intuitive, nurturing, and emotionally profound. There's often a natural sensitivity here to the emotional undercurrents. So there may be a strong bond to the home environment and often a very real connection to the ancestral field. So this placement can feel like someone who carries their lineage in their body, sometimes very consciously and sometimes unconsciously. There can also be a strong intuitive sensitivity to the past, not just personal past, but family memory or ancestral lines, or for someone who this may even feel like past life residue, because the fourth house is not only about the physical home, it's also about the deep psychic root system. So when the moon is here, the emotional body may be unusually receptive to what has been inherited, remembered, or carried through the lineage. So the shadow here is not emotional depth, it's emotional entanglement, becoming too fused with the family identity and living from inherited emotional memory and feeling overly responsible for holding the emotional weight of the home or lineage, or unconsciously staying attached to old pain because it feels familiar, or building identity around what once felt like emotional shelter, even when it no longer supports growth. So this can look like feeling overly shaped by family dynamics and having a hard time separating your own feelings from inherited emotional atmosphere, or holding on to the past because it feels safer than change, or retreating inward when life feels too exposed, or confusing emotional familiarity with true safety. So this placement can also create someone whose mood and sense of self is strongly affected by what is happening in the home or private life, because the fourth house is the foundation. So when something touches that foundation, the whole system can feel it. And if the early home environment was unstable, emotionally inconsistent, or burdened, then the person may learn to build the false self around protection, emotional retreat, or guarding the inner world very carefully. So the fear underneath can become, what if I lose my sense of home? What if I am not emotionally held? Or what if I have to leave what is familiar? Or what if the foundation is not safe? And what if I am carrying pain that didn't even begin with me? So this is where it gets deeper, because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. With Mercury, the added flavor comes from the sign, house, and aspects of Mercury can show how we make meaning. It can show how we think and how the mind interprets experiences. So for someone with the moon in the fourth house, may make meaning through emotional memory, through family imprinting, and through deeper feeling tones underneath life. Their thoughts may often circle around, what does this remind me of? Or why does this feel familiar? Or what is happening underneath the surface? Or what is the emotional truth beneath what's being said? That can create a deeper, intuitive, psychologically perspective mind. But it can also create a mind that lives too much in the past or interprets present life through old emotional material that has not yet been fully separated from the self. So when we look at Venus, depending on the sign, house placement, and aspects, shows what we value. It shows what we're drawn to. It shows what feels good. It also is what we attract based on our deeper relationships, worth, and desire. So with the moon in the fourth house, Venus can be drawn towards what feels emotionally familiar, safe, intimate, private, and nurturing. And the person may value emotional closeness, home energy, and the depth of feeling, and the people or relationships that evoke a sense of belonging. But the shadow here is that they may be attracted to what feels familiar, even when that familiarity comes from old family conditioning rather than true alignment. They may call everything love when what they're really feeling is a recognition to old emotional atmospheres. And when Mars comes in, flavored by the sign and house placement as well as aspects it is making, Mars is how we act. Mars is how we move. Mars is how we respond to something when something gets activated. So with the moon in the fourth house, Mars may act from the emotional roots. The person may become especially reactive. When home, family, privacy, vulnerability, and emotional security feels threatened, they may defend what feels personal very strongly. They may protect what they love very strongly. They may withdraw inwards when the system feels emotionally unsafe. So the moon in the fourth house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through home, memory, family, and emotional roots. So the growth here is not to stop caring about family and home or the past. It's not to become less sensitive to your ancestral or emotional roots. The growth is learning how to feel your roots without becoming bound by them, to honor what you come from without making your whole identity out of inherited feelings, or to recognize that emotional depth is a gift, but it doesn't have to become a prison of memory. So the work here is learning how to create home within yourself, to build inner safety that is not dependent on staying inside the old emotional structure, and to feel the lineage without carrying all of it as the self. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply intuitive, emotionally wise, protective in a healthy way, very rooted, capable of holding profound depth, and capable of creating a real sanctuary for themselves and others. And they're no longer unconsciously living inside inherited emotional material. They can begin to realize that I can honor where I come from without being defined by it. And I can feel deeply without becoming lost in the past. So if the moon in astrology shows where the self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the fourth house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through home, family, emotional roots, and inner belonging. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to memory, ancestry, and the private self and the deeper psychic foundation, and whose deeper work is learning how to honor the roots without mistaking the roots for the whole self. Moon in the fifth house. If you're looking at a chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning. It shows us memory. It shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of times, the moon shows the conditioned self. I call this the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the fifth house, the false self often goes looking for safety through expression. through being seen, through being felt, through being creative, romantic, through joy, through romance, through attention and affection, and the freedom to express what is inside. Because the fifth house is a house of self expression, it's a house of creativity, play, romance, pleasure, children, visibility. And it's the part of life where the self wants to radiate from inside out. So when the moon is here, is often deeply tied to expression. This can create someone who feels safest when they're able to express what they feel, when they are seen in their emotional reality, when their inner world has somewhere to go creatively, romantically, or personally. And this is often someone whose emotional life wants movement, not always practical movement, but expressive movement, because the fifth house wants to know, can I be seen here? Can I express myself here? Am I allowed to feel alive here? Is my heart welcome here? Can I create what I feel? So, in the inner cosmology, moon in the fifth house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by the need to express, create, or feel emotionally alive. So, who they think they are may become strongly tied to how loved they feel, how visible they feel, how emotionally received they feel, and whether there is space for their heart to radiate outward. Now, the false self here often gets formed around emotional expression and recognition. The person may unconsciously learn, I'm safe when I'm seen, I'm safe when I can express what I feel, I'm safe when my heart is received, or if I'm not seen, appreciated, or emotionally responded to, something in me starts to shut down. So the false self seeks safety through visibility and emotional expression. This may make the person warm, affectionate, expressive, creative, playful, and emotionally magnetic and deeply responsive to beauty and love and the experience of being felt. There is often a real gift here for creative expression, for emotional honesty through art and romance and storytelling, as well as performance or any form of heartfelt self revelation. So this person may naturally put feelings into what they create, or into how they love, or into how they show up when they feel safe enough to shine. But it can also create a self that becomes overly dependent on response. Because when the moon is in the fifth house, the heart may start to associate safety with being mirrored, appreciated, chosen, seen, desired, or emotionally engaged with. So if the person feels seen, they may feel more whole. And if they feel overlooked or unchosen or emotionally flat or creatively blocked, then the system starts to feel unsafe. So the shadow here is not joy. The shadow is emotional dependence on expression or validation, needing attention in order to feel secure, or needing romantic response in order to feel alive, or tying worth too closely to being chosen or admired or wanted or creatively recognized, or becoming dramatic or performative or emotionally exaggerated because the heart is trying to secure connection through expression. And so this can look like and so this can look like feeling emotionally dropped when attention fades, or seeking reassurance through romance or attraction, or over identifying with being desired, appreciated, or creatively validated, as well as feeling wounded when your expression is not received, or unconsciously performing emotion instead of simply inhabiting it. This placement can also create a person who is deeply tender around rejection, because the fifth house is the heart. And when something touches the heart here, it can feel very personal, not just disappointing, but personal. And if love, attention, play, or emotional expressions were inconsistent early on, the person may learn to build a false self around earning affection. being captivating, staying expressive, or keeping the heart visible in order to maintain connection. And the fear underneath it can become, what if I'm not seen? What if my heart is not received? What if no one responds to what I'm expressing? And what if I'm only safe when I'm wanted, loved, or emotionally mirrored? And this is where it gets deeper, because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system. So with Mercury, depending on the sign, house, and aspects it's making. Mercury is how we make meaning. Mercury is how we think about what we feel. Mercury is how the mind interprets experiences. And so, for someone with Moon in the fifth house, Mercury can make meaning through emotional expression, through response, and through the need to feel personally engaged. So, here the mind can often circulate around, was I seen? Did that land? Did they feel me? Was I appreciated? What does this say about how I am received? And that can create a mind that is emotionally expressive, creative, and personally invested in communication. But it can also create a mind that becomes too tied to response and recognition. Now, when we look at Venus, which is going to be flavored by the sign and the house placement, as well as the aspects that Venus is making, Venus shows us what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship with worth and desire. So, with the moon in the fifth house, Venus can be drawn towards romance, beauty, passion, inspiration, creativity, play, and people who make the heart feel lit up. So the person may value warmth, affection, delight, chemistry, creative aliveness, and emotional responsiveness. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn into what feels exciting or validating, and when it is not truly stable or nourishing. And they may call something love when what they are really feeling is the emotional high of being wanted or pursued or reflected. And when we come to Mars, the sign, the house, and the aspects Mars is making, Mars is how we act, how we move, how we respond when something gets activated. So when the moon is in the fifth house, Mars can act through the heart. The person may take action when they feel inspired or emotionally stirred or romantically drawn or creatively activated. But when hurt, rejected, or emotionally overlooked, their reaction may also become dramatic, impulsive, or deeply personal. They may pursue strongly when the heart is engaged or pull back sharply when it is wounded. So, the moon in the fifth house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through expression, affection, creativity, and emotional visibility. Now, the growth here is not to stop expressing, it's not to become less creative or less romantic or less heart led. The growth is in learning that your heart is real, even when it is not being mirrored back to you, and that your creativity is real, even before anyone responds to it, and that your emotional aliveness does not depend entirely on being chosen or admired or being seen in a certain way. The work here is to learn how to let expression come from truth rather than from the need for reassurance, to let the heart radiate without making response the measure of worth, and to enjoy being seen without needing visibility to confirm your existence. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes radiant and warm and creative and emotionally generous, romantically sincere, and capable of real joy and heartfelt expression. But they're no longer unconsciously seeking safety through constant reflection from the outside. They begin to realize, I can let my heart speak without needing every heart to answer, or I can create from what is true without making response my foundation. So if the moon in astrology is where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the fifth house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through expression and visibility and romance and joy, and the heart needs to be felt. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to creativity and affection and response and the need to feel alive through self-expression, and whose deeper work is learning that the heart does not become real only when it's seen. It is real because it's alive. Moon in the sixth house. If we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body, it shows us conditioning, it shows us memory, it shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very young. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the times, the moon shows the conditioned self, which I call the false self, the part of you that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the sixth house, the false self often goes looking for safety through order, through routine, through being useful, through being helpful, productive, also being needed, through self-improvement, and through staying on top of things and trying to manage life in a way that feels functional and under control. Because the sixth house is the house of daily life. It's a house of work, routine, habit, service, health, maintenance, the system that holds everyday reality together. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to function. This can create someone who feels safest when life feels organized, manageable, and productive, and when there's routine or there's structure, and they know what needs to be done and can stay engaged in it. And this often is someone whose emotional world gets closely linked to responsibility and daily order, because the sixth house wants to know what needs to be handled, what needs to be fixed, what needs attention right now, and how do I create stability through what I do every day. So the inner cosmology of the moon in the sixth house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped around the need to be useful, capable, organized, and responsive to the demands of daily life. Who they think they are may become tied to how well they are functioning, how much they're managing, how helpful they are, or whether they feel on top of what life is asking for them. So the false self here often forms around usefulness. The person may unconsciously learn, I am safe when I'm useful, I'm safe when I stay productive. When things are in order, I feel better. If I manage the details, then I can relax. Or if I keep improving, fixing, or doing what needs to be done, I will be okay. So the false self seeks safety through function. It can make the person dependable, thoughtful, observant, helpful, hardworking, and deeply responsive to what is needed in a practical sense. So there is often a great gift here for service, healing, maintenance, organization, and creating systems that support life. This person may naturally notice what is off, what needs refinement, what needs better work, what needs care. But they also create a self that becomes overly identified with doing. Because when the moon is in the sixth house, the emotional body can start to associate safety with staying busy, staying useful, solving problems, keeping life under control. So if the person feels productive or organized, then they feel more emotionally secure. If life becomes chaotic, inefficient, or uncertain, or even physically overwhelming, the whole system may start to feel unsafe. So the shadow here is not discipline. The shadow work is overmanagement, trying to control emotional discomfort through routine, or trying to earn safety through usefulness, or becoming overly critical when life is not perfectly ordered, or tying self-worth to too closely to function. and therefore rest begins to feel uncomfortable. So this can look like overworking when emotionally stressed, or becoming anxious when routines are disrupted, or becoming overly critical of yourself when you're not performing well, or feeling emotionally unsettled when life becomes messy, inefficient, or unpredictable. So this placement can also push emotions into the body, because the sixth house is connected to health and daily function. And the emotional body may express itself through tension and strain and fatigue and nervous overreaction, a sense that the system is carrying more than it can easily process. If early emotional safety depends on being helpful, staying responsible, or minimizing your own needs in order to keep life functioning, this person may build a false self around competence, around being the one who handles it, the one who keeps going, the one who stays useful. And the fear underneath can become, what if I stop being useful? What if everything falls apart? What if I miss something important? What if worth depends on how well I hold life together? This is where it gets deeper, because the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety. And the pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. So, with Mercury, depending on the sign, house, and the aspects it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. It's how we think about what we feel, and it's how the mind interprets experiences. So, for someone with Moon in the sixth house, Mercury may make meaning through practicality, or order, or responsibility and problem solving. And they may constantly evaluate what needs to be done, what needs to be improved, what's out of order here. What do I need to stay on top of? And that can create intelligence, precision, and strong practical awareness. But it also creates a mind that becomes overly focused on problems, pressure, self correction, or the need to manage everything in order to feel safe. When we look at Venus, flavored by the sign and house, as well as aspects it's making, Venus shows us what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So, with the moon in the sixth house, Venus can be drawn towards feeling stable, helpful, clean, consistent, and supportive in everyday life. So the person may value responsibility, effort, and practical care, as well as acts of service or health rhythms and relationships that feel functional and mutually supportive. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn to situations where they are needed more than they're truly met. They may call something love when what they're really feeling is the safety of being useful, wanted for what they do, or emotionally secured through responsibility. And then when we add Mars to this, based on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mars will show how we act, how we move, how we respond when something gets activated. So when the moon is in the sixth house, Mars may act through work, correction, improvement, and immediate response to what feels out of order. So the person may become reactive when life feels inefficient or chaotic or demanding, or they may push themselves harder and take on more. They may try to fix everything quickly or become irritable when the system feels overloaded. So the moon in the sixth house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through routine, usefulness, discipline, and function. So the growth here is not to stop caring about order, but it's not to become less responsible, less helpful, or less attentive. The growth is in learning your worth is not the same as usefulness, and that you do not have to earn safety by constantly holding everything together. And that life does not have to be perfectly managed for you to deserve rest and care or peace. And Also, the work here is learning how to let structure support you without making structure your identity, to let routine nourish the nervous system without becoming imprisoned by perfection, and to serve without disappearing into service. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply capable, grounded, attentive, helpful in meaningful ways, and devoted to what matters. They're able to create rhythms that genuinely support life. And they are no longer unconsciously trying to secure emotional safety through endless doing. They begin to realize I can be responsible without making responsibility my whole identity. I can care for what needs care without carrying everything alone. My worth is not measured only by what I produce, fix, or manage. So, if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the sixth house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through routine and usefulness, order, and the management of daily life. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to function and responsibility as well as service, and the need to keep life working, and whose deeper work is in learning that the true safety is not found only in what you do for life, but also how you allow life to hold you. Moon in the seventh house. Moon in the seventh house. If you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning. It shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early on. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of times, the moon shows the conditioned self, which is what I called the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the seventh house, the false self often goes looking for safety through relationship, through connection, through being emotionally mirrored, and through being met, or through closeness, or through having another person there to reflect, confirm, or stabilize the self. Because the seventh house is the house of other. It's a house of partnership, one-on-one bonds, projection, intimacy, commitment. It is the relational mirror through which we often look to know ourselves. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to relationships. It can create someone who feels safest when they're emotionally connected, when there is someone to share with, when there is mutuality, when there is reflection, when there's a sense that their inner world is being received by another person. And it is often someone whose emotional life becomes highly activated in close relationships. So the seventh house wants to know who is across from me. Am I being met here? Am I seen in relationship? Can I trust this bond? Can I regulate through connection? Can I feel safe with another person present? In the inner cosmology, the moon in the seventh house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by the need for relational mirroring, for emotional reciprocity or closeness with another. So, who they think they are may become strongly tied to how they are perceived in relationships, how connected they feel, how emotionally partnered they feel, and whether the self feels reflected back through another person. So the false self here often formed around emotional reflection. The person may unconsciously learn, am I safe when I'm connected? Am I safe when someone is there with me? Am I safe when I feel emotionally mirrored? I have a relationship that I can settle. So the false self feels safe through the other. This can make the person relationally aware, emotionally responsive, caring, thoughtful in partnership, and deeply attuned to the emotional field between self and other. And there's often a real gift here for understanding emotional dynamics and for creating emotional connections and for sensing what the other feels and for valuing relationships as an important part of life. But it can also create a self that becomes overly dependent on relationship for emotional orientation because the moon in the seventh house connection can start to feel like identity. So if the person feels emotionally met, they feel more whole. And if they feel disconnected, rejected, emotionally unseen, or relationally uncertain, the system may start to feel unsafe. The shadow here is not love. The shadow is emotional outsourcing, looking for relationships to provide identity, grounding, and inner confirmation, becoming too dependent on being mirrored, confusing attachment with safety, projecting emotional needs into partnerships, or shaping the self around what keeps connection intact. So this can look like over prioritizing relationships in order to feel emotionally secure, or having a hard time being with yourself when there is no mirror, or feeling deeply unsettled by distance, conflict, or disconnection, adapting too much in relationships so that the bond feels safe, or measuring your worth through how wanted, chosen, or emotionally received you feel. This placement can also create a person who is highly sensitive on how they are responding because the seventh house is relational. So tone matters, reciprocity matters, presence matters, the quality of the bond matters. And if early emotional safety depended on keeping the peace or maintaining connection, or being chosen, or learning to regulate through another person's presence, then the person may build the false self around partnership itself. The fear underneath can become, what if I'm alone? What if I'm not being met? What if others withdraw? What if I lose the mirror? What if I don't know myself without relationships? And this is where it gets deeper. Because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. Mercury, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. It's how we think about what we feel. It is how the mind interprets experience. So, for someone with the moon in the seventh house, Mercury may make meaning through relationship. Their mind may constantly evaluate, how are we doing? What do they mean by this? Do they still feel connected to me? Am I being understood? What is happening between us? That can create a mind that is relationally intelligent, perceptive, and sensitive to nuance in one-on-one dynamics. But it can also create a mind that becomes preoccupied with other, too shaped by relational interpretation, or too dependent on external feedback in order to feel clear. So then we have Venus, and Venus's influence will also depend on the sign, the house, and the aspects Venus is making. But Venus shows what we value and what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So with Moon in the seventh house, Venus may be drawn towards intimacy and partnership, neutrality, emotional availability, and people who feel responsive and relationally present. So the person may value togetherness and harmony and companionship and the sense of emotional completion that can come through a close bond. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn to relationship not only because it is aligned, but because it regulates the emotional body. They may call something love when what they are really feeling is relief, that they are not alone inside themselves. And then it comes to Mars. And again, this is flavored by Mars, depending on its sign, house, and aspects it's making. But Mars is how we act. Mars is how we move. It's how we respond when something gets activated. So with the moon in the seventh house, Mars may act through relationship dynamics. the person may become reactive when connection feels threatened, when they feel conflict, when they feel emotionally unmet, or when the bond becomes unstable. They may pursue strongly when they feel they want connection, or adapt quickly in order to preserve harmony, or become emotionally reactive when the other person stirs insecurity in the attachment field. So the moon in the seventh house can set the tone on how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through partnership, reflection, and emotional exchange. So the growth here is not to stop valuing relationships. It is not to become less loving, less connected, or open in partnership. The growth is learning that relationship can enrich the self without becoming the source of the self. That connection is beautiful, but it is not meant to replace inner grounding, and that being emotionally mirrored is not the same thing as truly knowing who you are. And the work here is learning how to stay in relationship without abandoning your own center, and to receive love without making love the only place where your emotional body knows how to settle, and to let connection reveal you without asking connection to define you. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply relational, emotionally aware, capable of intimacy, and sensitive to partnership in a real and meaningful way, and are able to create mutuality, care, and emotional presence with another person. But they're no longer unconsciously seeking safety through losing themselves in the mirror of relationship. They begin to realize I can love deeply without disappearing into the bond. And I can be emotionally connected without outsourcing my center. So, if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the seventh house shows the conditioned self that looks for safety through relationship, emotional mirroring, and closeness with the other. So it shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to partnership, reciprocity, and the experience of being met, and whose deeper work is learning that true safety is not only found in being held by another, but also in becoming someone who can remain inwardly held within a relationship itself. Moon in the eighth house. If you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us our conditioning. It shows us our memory. It shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the times, the moon shows the conditioned self, which I call the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the eighth house, the false self often goes looking for safety through emotional depth, through intensity, through bonding, through merging, through deep emotional exchange, also through knowing what is hidden and through feeling what is underneath the surface, and through sensing what is unspoken, unprocessed, or psychologically charged. Because the eighth house is the house of intimacy, it's a house of vulnerability and trust and power. Also, shared resources, emotional entanglements, psychological depth. It's also our shadow material, death, rebirth, and transformation. So, when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to intensity. And this can create someone who feels safest when things are emotionally real, when the surface is broken through, when there is honesty beneath appearance, and when the bond feels deep, consequential, and transformative. And this is often someone whose emotional world doesn't stay light for very long, because the eighth house wants to know what is really going on here. Can I trust what is underneath the surface? Is the bond real? What is hidden here? What is happening if I open fully? And also, what happens if I lose control? So the inner cosmology of the moon in the eighth house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by depth and vulnerability and trust and the need to understand what is happening underneath things. So who they think they are may become strongly tied to how deeply they bond, how much they can trust, how safe they feel in intimacy, and whether they can stay protected inside emotional merging. So the false self here often forms around emotional depth and control. And the person may unconsciously learn, I am safe when I know what is really going on. I'm safe when I can feel what others are hiding. I'm safe when the bond is deep, or I'm safe when I stay aware of what could hurt me. So the false self seeks safety through intensity. This can make the person emotionally perceptive, intuitive, psychologically aware, deeply loyal, and sensitive to energy, and capable of holding profound emotional truth. There is often a real gift here for seeing beneath the appearances and for sensing what others do not say, or for holding complexity. This placement can feel almost psychic at times, in the sense that the emotional body is tuned to the subtext, to the motive, to the undercurrents, and to vulnerability. It can also create a self that becomes overly attached to emotional intensity, because when the moon is in the eighth house, depth can start to feel like safety. If the person feels a strong bond, they feel more emotionally real. If things feel too shallow or detached or undefined or too emotionally guarded, the system may start to feel unsafe. So the shadow here is not depth, the shadow is emotional survival through intensity, trying to feel safe but staying hyper aware, or trying to protect the heart through control. So this could look like difficulty trusting fully, or fear of betrayal or emotional exposure, or becoming overly guarded or overly immersed, or also feeling intensely affected by relational undercurrents. You can also hold on to old emotional wounds. And this placement can also create a person whose emotional body is strongly shaped by loss, secrecy, power dynamics, or inherited emotional material that runs below the surface. Because the eighth house is not casual. It's a part of life where we meet what changes us. So, if early emotional experiences involved instability in trust, emotional enmeshment, control, or deep psychic intensity, the person may build a false self around vigilance, around depth reading, around emotional caution. So, the fear underneath can become, what if I trust and I get hurt? Or what if I open and I lose? So, what if I merge and I disappear? And this is where it gets deep, because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern is often influencing the rest of the inner system too. So, with Mercury, based on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. It's how we think about what we feel. It's how the mind interprets experiences. So, for someone with the moon in the eighth house, Mercury may make meaning through depth and suspicion and psychological insights and emotional subtext. And their mind may constantly ask, what is not being said? What does this really mean? Can I trust this? What is happening underneath the interaction? What deeper motive is there? That can create a penetrating mind, strong intuition, and genuine psychological intelligence. But it can also create a mind that becomes overly vigilant, emotionally suspicious, or too fused with the need to interpret hidden meaning everywhere. When we look at Venus based on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Venus will show us what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So, with the moon in the eighth house, Venus may be drawn towards intimacy, depth, vulnerability, emotional honesty, and strong bonding, and experiences that feel transformative. And the person may value devotion, loyalty, trust, and connection that touch the deeper layers of the psyche. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn to intensity even when the intensity is not healthy. They may call something love when what they're really feeling is an emotional charge or the familiar gravity of unresolved wounds. And then comes Mars. Now, Mars depends again on the sign, the house, and the aspects that it's making. Mars can define how we act and how we move, as well as how we respond when things get activated. So, the moon in the eighth house. So, with the moon in the eighth house, Mars may act through emotional depth and defensiveness, as well as intensity and a strong reaction around trust and vulnerability. And the person may become especially reactive and when they feel exposed, betrayed, left in the dark, or emotionally powerless. They may protect fiercely, they may withdraw deeply, they may push for truth, or react strongly when someone touches an old wound around trust, intimacy, or control. So the moon in the eighth house can set the tone and how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through depth, trust, merging, and emotional power. So the growth here is not to stop feeling deeply. The growth is to learn that true safety does not come only from depth and control and emotional vigilance. And that intimacy is not always truth. And that vulnerability becomes safer when it is conscious rather than defended. So the work here is learning how to open without dissolving into fear or control, to feel deeply without becoming trapped in the emotional underworld that defines the self. So, to let transformation happen without building an identity around pain and secrecy or survival. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something powerful happens. The person becomes emotionally profound, intuitive, psychologically aware, capable of real intimacy, capable of holding truth and transformation with depth and maturity. So they're no longer unconsciously seeking safety through crisis vigilance or emotional entanglement. They begin to realize I can go deep without getting lost. I can be vulnerable without giving my power away. So, if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the eighth house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through depth, intimacy, emotional truth, and the need to understand what is hidden. And it shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to trust, vulnerability, psychic undercurrents, and transformation, and whose deeper work is learning that true safety is not found only in guarding the depth, but in becoming someone who can enter those depths consciously without being consumed. Moon in the ninth house. If you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning. It shows us memory. It shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early in life. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the time, the moon shows the conditioned self. And I call this the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the ninth house, the false self often goes looking for safety through meaning, through belief, through perspective, through philosophy, also through higher truth and spiritual frameworks. They need to understand life as a part of something larger because the ninth house is the house of higher learning, philosophy, faith, religion, truth seeking, travel, wisdom, expansion, and the larger framework through which a person understands life. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to meaning. It can create someone who feels safest when life makes sense on a larger level. When there's a more objective perspective, and a perspective that's big enough to hold what they're feeling, when there's also purpose, when there's a path that helps them orient emotionally. And this often is someone whose emotional life needs space, not only physical space, but psychic space, mental space, spiritual space. Because the ninth house wants to know, what does this mean? What truth can hold this experience? What bigger picture am I a part of? And what belief helps me to orient in life? Also, where am I going? So, in the inner cosmology, Moon in the ninth house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by the need for meaning, expansion, and a larger truth that can hold the emotional life. Who they think they are may become strongly tied to what they believe and what gives life meaning, what worldview they live inside of, and whether they feel emotionally connected to something bigger than themselves. So the false self here often forms around meaning making. So the person may unconsciously learn, I am safe when life has meaning. I am safe when I believe in something. I am safe when I can rise above what I'm feeling and place it in a bigger frame. So the false self here seeks safety through expansion. This may make the person insightful, wise, curious, also very spiritually open and philosophically engaging, as well as emotionally nourished by truth and learning and perspective. So there is often a real gift here for seeing beyond the immediate moment, for understanding emotional experiences in a wider context, and for seeking wisdom and for learning through life, for holding suffering inside a larger vision of truth, meaning, or purpose. But it can also create a life that becomes overly attached to perspective. Because when the moon is in the ninth house, meaning can start to feel like safety itself. So if the person has a belief system, a spiritual framework, or a philosophy, or a sense of direction, they may feel emotionally anchored. But if life feels meaningless and directionless or too confined, the system may start to feel unsafe. So the shadow work here is not wisdom, it's emotional bypass through meaning, trying to rise above feelings instead of fully inhabiting them, using spirituality or philosophy or belief to avoid emotional immediacy, needing a bigger explanation in order to feel okay, or attaching identity too strongly to worldview. So this could look like explaining pain without feeling it, or using spiritual language to distance from the emotional reality, or constantly searching for the next teaching, the next path, or perspective to feel okay, or also becoming deeply unsettled when meaning collapses and no larger framework seems to hold. So this placement, it can also create a person who feels emotionally nourished by movement and learning and expansion. So when life becomes too stagnant or narrow or repetitive, the emotional body may feel trapped. And if early emotional safety came through religion, belief, moral structure, education, or a sense of life that had to mean something in order to be bearable, then the person may build the false self around the seeker, around the one who's always learning, the one who's always moving, always orienting towards a bigger horizon. The fear underneath can become, what if life has no meaning? What if I lose faith? What if my worldview breaks apart? What if I can't rise above this? This is where it gets deeper, because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the system too. So with Mercury, depending on its sign, its house, and the aspects that it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. Mercury is how we think about what we feel. Mercury is how the mind interprets experiences. So, for someone with the moon in the ninth house, Mercury can make meaning through belief, philosophy, and a spirituality, higher truth. and the big picture interpretations. So their mind may constantly ask, what is the lesson here? What is this teaching me? How do I understand this from a wider perspective? And how do I place this inside a bigger framework? This can create wisdom, insight, and a mind that naturally seeks coherence. But it can also create a mind that moves too quickly into expansion before the emotional body has actually had time to feel what it feels. So when we look at Venus based on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Venus shows what we value. It shows what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. With the moon in the ninth house, Venus may be drawn towards people, experiences, and paths that feel expansive, inspiring, meaningful, and spiritually alive. So the person may value truth and freedom as well as learning and growing. And they enjoy philosophy and relationships that open the mind and widen the heart. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn to possibilities more than embodiment, and they may call something love when what they're really feeling is emotional relief of expansion and inspiration or escape into a wider vision. And when it comes to Mars, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mars is how we act, it's how we move, and it's also how we respond when something gets activated. So with the moon in the ninth house, Mars may act through conviction, belief, and also the search for a wider horizon. So the person may react strongly when beliefs are challenged and when life feels confining or when their emotional needs for meaning is threatened. They may move towards travel, learning, teaching, and truth seeking. So the moon in the ninth house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through meaning, through perspective, belief, and emotional expansion. And the growth here is not to stop seeking meaning. It is not to become less spiritual, less curious, or less devoted to truth. The truth is learning that meaning is deepest when it includes the emotional body and not when it replaces it. And that wisdom is not only the ability to rise above experiences, it's the ability to stay present inside it. And that truth does not need to become an escape from feeling. It can become a vessel that helps feeling unfold more consciously. So the work here is to learn how to let beliefs support the heart without using belief to outrun it. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes wise, open hearted, meaningful, emotionally spacious, and capable of holding life inside a larger truth without denying what is human and immediate. So they're no longer unconsciously seeking safety through constant escape into higher explanations. They begin to realize I can seek without abandoning what I feel, and I can hold a larger perspective without leaving my emotional reality behind. So, if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the ninth house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through meaning, belief, and truth, as well as perspective and the search for something larger. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to worldview, expansion, and the need for life to feel purposeful and coherent, and whose deeper work is learning that true safety is not found only in rising above experiences, but also in allowing truth to meet the emotional body right where it is. Moon in the 10th house. If you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body. It shows us conditioning. It shows us memory, as well as it shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early on. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the times, the moon shows the conditioned self, which I call the false self. the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the 10th house, the false self often goes looking for safety through visibility, through achievement and purpose and recognition, also being seen in the world, being respected, and having direction through becoming someone, because the 10th house is a house of public life. It's a house of vocation and reputation and authority. It also shows our life direction, our achievements, and our status. It shows the visible role that we play. And this is also an angular house. This means it carries a strong structural influence in the chart. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to public life, outer direction, and how the self is received in the world. And this can create someone who feels safest when they know where they're going, when they feel respected, when there's purpose, and when they feel seen in what they're doing, and their efforts hold weight in the outer world. So this is often someone whose emotional life gets closely tied to performance and responsibility as well as reputation or the need to establish themselves. So the 10th house wants to know, what am I building? What am I becoming? How am I seen? What is my role? Am I respected here, or am I doing enough with my life? So the inner cosmology with the moon in the 10th house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by visibility, purpose, and the need to feel solid in the eyes of the world. So who they think they are may become strongly tied to what they accomplish, how useful or capable they appear, and how they are received publicly, and whether they feel emotionally confirmed through external direction and recognition. The false self here often forms around achievement and role. And the person may unconsciously learn that I'm safe when I'm doing something meaningful, or when I'm respected, or when I have direction, or when I become someone with a title, then I'll feel secure. Or when I seem capable, then I can relax. So the false self seeks safety through public structure. It can make the person responsible, driven, and also emotionally mature, aware of the consequences, and highly attuned to what it takes to build something real in the world. There is often a real gift here for leadership and devotion, as well as public contribution and emotional investment in a meaningful life path. And this person may naturally feel called to create something visible and to carry responsibility and to build a life that has shape, direction, and weight. So it can also create a person who becomes overly identified with a role, because when the moon is in the 10th house, achievement can start to feel like safety itself. So if the person feels effective or respected or externally confirmed, they may feel more emotionally secure. And if direction collapses, recognition fades, or public identity feels uncertain, the system may start to feel unsafe. So the shadow here is not ambition. The shadow is emotional dependence on achievement, image, and external confirmation, trying to earn safety through success, or trying to regulate insecurity by becoming more accomplished, or tying worth too closely to responsibility, reputation, or performance, or building the whole self around what the world can see. And this can look like feeling emotionally unsettled when they're not productive, or measuring their value through success or recognition, or becoming overly invested in how others perceive you. So, this placement can also create a person who learned early on that being capable and composed, as well as successful or responsible, was somehow connected to love and acceptance or emotional stability. Sometimes this happens in obvious ways, but sometimes it's very subtle. The person may feel that they have to hold themselves together, to be the strong one, to be the adult, to be the one who has direction, be the one who is seen as competent. And if that becomes too deeply identified with survival, the false self may form around image and role and outer strength. And the fear underneath it can become, what if I fail? What if I'm not respected? What if I can't do enough? What if I can't become enough? What if my direction is not clear? And this is where it gets deeper, because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. So with Mercury, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. It is how we think about what we feel. It is how the mind interprets experiences. So for someone with moon in the 10th house, Mercury may make meaning through purpose and success, as well as responsibility and public image. Their mind may constantly evaluate, what am I doing with my life? How am I being perceived? Am I moving forward? Am I respected? They can create a mind that is strategic and focused and also aware of long term consequences. But it can also create a mind that becomes overly shaped by pressure and external expectations, as well as the need to keep proving themselves. Then, when we look at Venus, depending on the sign, house, and aspects it's making, Venus shows what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So, with the moon in the 10th house, Venus may be drawn towards feeling accomplished or stable or admirable or respectable or socially significant. So, the person may value ambition, maturity, recognition, and relationships or environments that reinforce purpose and direction. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn towards what looks successful more than actually nourishing the heart. So they may call something love when what they really feel is an emotional reassurance through status, security, admiration, or the comfort of being defined by a role. And so when we look at Mars based on the sign, the house, and the aspect it's making, Mars is how we act, it's how we move, it's how we respond when something gets activated. So, with the moon in the 10th house, Mars may act through achievement, public effort, control, and the drive to keep moving forward. The person may become reactive when they feel disrespected or overlooked or blocked. They may work harder, push more, take more responsibility, become even more driven when the emotional body feels threatened by failure or instability. So, the moon in the 10th house can set the tone and how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through purpose, role, visibility, and accomplishment. The growth here is not to stop caring about purpose. The growth is learning that your worth is not equal to your role, and that your emotional reality does not need to be earned through achievement, and that becoming respected in the world is valuable, but it's not the same thing as being inwardly held. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply capable, purposeful, emotionally mature, publicly meaningful. They're able to hold responsibility and create a real impact in the world. And so they're no longer unconsciously seeking safety through achievement alone. And they begin to realize that I can build something meaningful without making success my only source of self. Or I can be seen in the world without losing my inner life. Or I can carry responsibility without using it to prove my worth. So, if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the 10th shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through purpose and visibility, as well as achievements and being recognized in the world. So it shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to direction and reputation. and the need to become something solid in the outer world, and whose deeper work is learning that true safety is not found only in what you build or how you're seen. It is in becoming someone who can remain inwardly real, even beyond the image, role, and achievement. Moon in the 11th house. So, if we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. The moon shows us the emotional body, it shows us conditioning, and it shows us memory. It shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early in life. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the time, the moon shows the conditioned self. I call this the false self, the part of us that learned how to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the 11th house, the false self often goes looking for safety through belonging, through friendship, through community, through shared ideas and social connections, and through group identity. So, because the 11th house is the house of community, it is the house of friendship, network, collective spaces, shared visions, social belonging, future goals, as well as the wider field of people and possibility we're connected to. And when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to the social field. This can create someone who feels safest when they feel included, when they feel connected to people who understand them, and when they feel resonance with a group or a vision or a shared purpose or a sense of collective belonging. And this often is someone whose social life becomes activated through friendship, community, social spaces, and the future they imagine themselves growing into. Because the 11th house wants to know, where do I belong? Where are my people? What future am I moving towards? And what vision holds me? Where do I fit into the larger field? And so, in the inner cosmology, the moon in the 11th house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by belonging to group resonance and to search for emotional safety through shared spaces and shared direction. Who they think they are may become strongly tied to communities that move through the friendship they keep or the causes they align with. So the false self often forms around belonging, and the person may unconsciously learn, I feel safe when I am a part of something. I'm safe when I feel included. I feel safe when I have people around me who reflect my values and vision. So the false self feels safety through community. This can make the person caring and socially aware as well as future oriented. They're emotionally responsive to group dynamics and deeply attuned to what it means to find one's group of people. There's often a real gift here for friendship, for collaboration, for community building, and for feeling into the emotional field of collective space. And this person may naturally care about shared values, shared goals, and shared meaning. They may feel emotionally nourished when they're part of something that feels bigger than just their private life. But it can also create a self that becomes overly dependent on group identity. Because when the moon is in the 11th house, belongings can start to feel like safety itself. So if the person feels included, seen by their community, or aligned with a shared vision, they may feel more emotionally settled. But if they feel excluded and disconnected or socially displaced or uncertain about where they belong, the system may feel unsafe. So the shadow here is not community, it's emotional dependence on belonging, needing external resonance in order to feel secure, or tying identity too closely to a group or a social role or a collective ideal, or shaping the self around what keeps acceptance intact. So this can look like over identifying with community or social roles, or feeling deeply unsettled when friendships shift or dissolve, or adapting yourself in order to maintain belonging. So, this placement can also create sensitivity to exclusion because the 11th house is not just about being social, it's about where we feel ourselves in relation to the collective field. So, when something touches that field, rejection, disconnection, social invisibility, or misalignment with the community you're in, then it may feel much deeper than it looks on the surface. And if early emotional safety was tied to fitting in, being accepted by peers, or aligning with a group, or finding emotional regulation through friendships rather than private intimacy, this person may build a false self around collectivity, around being one of us, or around group identification, or around shared ideas that provide emotional orientation. The fear underneath can become, what if I don't belong anywhere? What if I'm outside of the group? What if the people I identified with no longer reflect me? So, this is where it gets deeper because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then the pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. So with Mercury, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. It's how we think about what we feel. It's about how the mind interprets experiences. So for someone with the moon in the 11th house, Mercury may make meaning through the collective field. Their mind may constantly evaluate, where do I fit in? Who am I aligned with? What community reflects me? What future am I building towards? That can create a mind that is socially perceptive, visionary, and attuned to networks and shared values as well as group dynamics. But it can also create a mind that becomes overly preoccupied with social positioning, belonging, or whether the person is still in resonance with the people around it. Then, when we look at Venus based on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, we show what we value. We'll show what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So, when the moon is in the 11th house, Venus may be drawn to friendships and shared ideals, as well as social harmony, kindred spirits, or community spaces, and also people who evoke resonance, familiarity, and shared direction. So the person may value intellectual or emotional companionship or collective purpose and the feeling of being understood by those who share a similar vision. So the shadow here is that they may be drawn towards what feels socially confirming more than what is individually true. And they may call something love when what they're really feeling is a relief of finally belonging somewhere. And when it comes to Mars, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mars is how we act, it's how we move, it's how we respond when something gets activated. So when the moon is in the 11th house, Mars may act through the social field. So the person may become reactive around friendship dynamics, around group tensions, or exclusion, or shared goals, or ideological alignment, and they may push towards community, defend their place in a group, or act on behalf of a cause, or become emotionally activated when they feel outside of the circle. So the moon in the 11th can set the tone and how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through friendship, belonging, resonance, and the wider collective field. So the growth here is not to stop valuing community, and it's not to become less relational or less visionary or less invested in shared purpose. The growth is learning that belonging is meaningful, but it's not meant to replace inner ground. The community can support the self without becoming the source of the self. And resonance is beautiful, but it is not the same thing as identity. Because when this placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply connected, insightful in friendships, emotionally aware within a group, and are able to build community, hold, and contribute to something larger in a meaningful way. This happens when they're no longer unconsciously seeking safety through social identification alone. Then they'll realize I can belong without betraying myself. I can love community without needing it to define me. So if the moon in astrology shows where the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the 11th house shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through friendship, community, resonance, shared ideals, and belonging in the collective field. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to emotional connection, to social connection, to future vision, and to the need to feel part of something larger than the isolated self, and whose deeper work is to learn that the true self is not found only in being held by the group, but also in being someone who can stay inwardly real while participating in the collective field. Moon in the 12th house. So, if we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then the moon shows us something very important. It shows us the emotional body, it shows us conditioning, it shows us memory, it shows us what became familiar, protective, and emotionally safe very early on. And because of that, the moon is not always the deepest truth of who we are. A lot of the time, the moon shows the conditioned self, which I call the false self, the part of us that learned to adapt emotionally in order to feel safe. So when the moon is in the 12th house, the false self often goes looking for safety through retreat, through withdrawal, solitude, the inner world, through invisibility, and maybe even spiritual escapism, or into dreams, or through hidden private or beyond ordinary awareness. Because the 12th house is the house of the unseen, it's the house of the unconscious, hidden patterns, dreams, solitude, endings, spiritual life, dissolution, self undoing, as well as the parts of the psyche that are not always fully available for the conscious mind. So when the moon is here, the emotional body often becomes deeply tied to what is beneath the surface. This can create someone who feels safest when they're alone with their inner world, when they're not overly exposed, when there's space to feel privately, when there's room to drift inwards, sense beyond the obvious, and to move through life in a more subtle way. And this is often someone whose emotional body is not fully visible, even to themselves at times, because the 12th house wants to know what is happening underneath all of this. What am I feeling that I cannot fully name? What lives in the hidden layers of the self? What is mine and what have I absorbed? Or where do I go when the world feels too much? So, in the inner cosmology, Moon in the 12th house can look like a person whose emotional identity becomes shaped by the hidden world, by the unconscious, the private self, the dream field, and the need to feel safe away from too much exposure. So, who they think they are may become strongly tied to what they feel in solitude and what they sense but cannot always explain, and how they protect themselves by withdrawing into inner space. So the false self here often forms around invisibility and inner escape. The person may unconsciously learn, I'm safe when I keep my feelings private, or I'm safe when I withdraw before I'm overwhelmed. So the false self seeks safety through retreat. This can make the person feel deeply intuitive, compassionate, psychically sensitive, spiritually receptive, imaginative, and emotionally attuned to what others often miss. There's often a real gift here, a subtle perception for dream life, for spiritual depth, and for feeling what is unspoken, and for sensing collective or ancestral emotional material moving beneath the surface. So this placement, the person may pick up emotional atmospheres very easily. They may feel what others do not say. They may have a hard time knowing where their own emotional field ends and the other begins. Because when the moon is in the 12th house, privacy can start to feel like safety itself. So if the person can retreat, go inward, dream, escape, or remain emotionally unreadable, they feel more protected. But if they are forced into too much exposure, emotional clarity, or external demand, the system may start to feel unsafe. So the shadow here is not sensitivity, it's emotional invisibility, losing yourself in the unconscious, absorbing too much, or not knowing what is yours, or repressing feelings because they're too difficult to name, or being too hidden from yourself that your emotional life starts shaping you from behind the scenes. So this can look like difficulty naming what you feel or withdrawing when emotions become overwhelming, or absorbing the mood of others and carrying them as your own, or feeling unseen but also afraid of being fully seen. So this placement can also create a person who carries grief that is not entirely personal, because the 12th house can hold collective material, ancestral residue, and past life symbolism, old emotional currents that were never fully processed and now live in the deeper waters of the psyche. And if early emotional safety depended on disappearing, or staying quiet, or becoming invisible, or suppressing your needs, or managing your pain through withdrawal, then the person may build a false self around not taking up too much space, or emotional diffusion, or staying one step behind. The fear underneath can become, what if I'm too exposed? What if I cannot protect my sensitivities? What if I don't know what I really feel? And this is where it gets deeper, because if the moon is shaping the emotional pattern of safety, then that pattern often influences the rest of the inner system too. So with Mercury, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mercury is how we make meaning. It is how we think about what we feel. It is how the mind interprets experiences. So, for someone with the moon in the 12th house, Mercury may make meaning through intuition, symbols, dreams, subtle impressions, and unconscious material. Their mind may often ask, what does this feeling mean? Or why do I feel something I can't explain? Or is this mine, or am I picking up on something beyond me? That can create a mind that is deeply reflective and symbolic and imaginative and spiritually perceptive. But it can also create a mind that becomes confused, flooded, uncertain, or dissolved in what cannot be clearly named. Then let's look at Venus. Venus, depending on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, will show us what we value, what we're drawn to, what feels good, what we attract based on our deeper relationship to worth and desire. So, with the moon in the 12th house, Venus may be drawn to what feels spiritual, subtle, private, mysterious, compassionate, or emotional transcendent. The person may value solitude, sacred connection, dreamlike intimacy, or emotional softness and space where they don't have to be overly defined. But the shadow here is that they may be drawn towards feeling elusive more than feeling grounded. And they may call something love when what they're really feeling is a familiarity of longing, rescue, fantasy, or emotional merging without clear form. And when it comes to Mars, based on the sign, the house, and the aspects it's making, Mars is how we act. Mars is how we move, how we respond when something gets activated. So when the moon is in the 12th, Mars may act indirectly. The person may withdraw rather than confront. They may internalize rather than express. They may disappear rather than assert, or act from hidden emotional pressure that has been building beneath awareness. They may become reactive, overstimulated, or unable to protect their inner space. So the moon in the 12th house can set the tone for how the whole inner cosmology organizes itself around safety through privacy, inner retreat, spiritual sensitivity, and hidden emotional process. So growth is learning that sensitivity does not require self erasure. that privacy is valuable, but it doesn't have to become invisibility. And that retreat can be healing, but it is different from disappearing from yourself. And the work here is learning how to bring compassion and consciousness into what lives beneath the surface and to feel deeply without dissolving into everything you feel and to let solitude restore you without turning it into the only place you know how to be safe. Because when placement becomes conscious, something beautiful happens. The person becomes deeply compassionate, spiritually attuned, emotionally subtle, imaginative, and intuitive, and capable of holding the unseen dimensions of life with real grace and tenderness. They are no longer unconsciously seeking safety through disappearance or confusion or emotional diffusion. They begin to realize I can be sensitive without abandoning myself, or I can protect my inner world without hiding from life. So, if the moon in astrology shows that the false self goes looking for safety, then the moon in the 12th shows a conditioned self that looks for safety through retreat, privacy, hidden feelings, spiritual space, and the unseen world of the psyche. It shows a person whose emotional body is closely tied to the unconscious and the subtle perception, solitude, and the deeper waters beneath the ordinary awareness, and whose deeper work is to learn that true safety is not found only in retreat from the world, but also in becoming someone who can bring compassion, presence, and consciousness to the hidden emotional life within. So hopefully this gave you a deeper way to understand the moon and the houses, because the moon is not just describing your emotions, it's showing you the inner cosmology of safety, where the emotional body goes for comfort, protection, familiarity, and for belonging. And when we look at it through shadow work, we begin to see that the false self forms around emotional patterns. And this doesn't mean that we need to judge them, we just need to become conscious of them, because shadow work is how we move from unconsciously living inside those patterns to actually witnessing them and eventually coming back into relationship with our deeper truth, our authentic core, which is our sun sign, the self beneath the conditioning. So, if this resonated with you, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the hype button. I appreciate that. And share with someone who may find this helpful. And if you'd like to go deeper into this work, I host a free shadow work circle every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And also, if you would like to download a free copy of my shadow work beginner's guide, I know I have a bonus mini course. You can go to my website at starwellastro.com. And also, if you're interested in natal chart readings or one-on-one shadow work guidance, go to my website for more information at starwellastro.com. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.